I suddenly saw one of the creepiest looking guys I've ever seen in my whole life. Just the mere idea of this guy made me think of a monster. He was freaky looking. I think you've probably had the same kind of situation where you're just minding your own business and you see somebody on the street and they just impress you as freaky, almost like they're devilish or there's something wrong. These are not people who are necessarily mentally ill. That's okay to be mentally ill, but there's a different form of it. It's like not mentally ill, it's crazy. If you ever seen somebody that looks so crazy, they could go ahead and whatever they wanted, they could just rip somebody's heart out of their chest. Have you ever seen somebody like that? Well, that's somebody that I saw. And I saw this person numerous times. I think it was in 1981. I was 25 years old, and it was my job at the time to drive around town. I lived in Reno, Nevada, and it was my job to drive around town to visit crime scenes and to go to the police department and the district attorney's office, and on occasion to the jail to check out on what the status of prisoners was. You see, my job at the newspaper that I worked for was as a crime reporter, a police beat. The term in the industry then was the cops beat. But when I drive down, I think it was called Coonsley Street in Reno, near Kitsky Lane, that's the first time I remember seeing this. He was a monster to me, a literal monster. He was very young, probably in his late teens, but his hair was like sticking straight up, and it was like red, 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 red. And it was not just like red like somebody would dye it to try to look cool or whatever. And the look in his eyes were not human. And the first time I recall seeing him, he was riding a bicycle and he was just like looking around, and the look on his face was the worst look imaginable. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody like I'm trying to describe. Picture a face that looks plastic, but as I mentioned, his eyes creeped me out. They like bugged me down to the heart of my soul. And I'm not just saying this to make some kind of a description that seems out of place. This was true. It just like stuck me. I'd never seen somebody like this. And the way he was looking around as he would drive his bicycle, he was on his bicycle, of course. And it was like he had no specific determined path. It was like he had no place specifically that he wanted to go, even though he was driving down the street. So I saw him perhaps on a weekday, one week. And this thought of him didn't leave my mind. I really continued to remember who this guy was, what he looked like. And another day, I was downtown, closer to the center of downtown Reno, on West 2nd Street near downtown, and there he was again. And my creep alarm in my head went, boo-doo, boo-doo, boo-doo. The guy, the mere appearance gave me the creeps. Think of somebody that's covered in slime, like some kind of a person from hell. Slime is just dripping off of him. And if I looked at this guy's face, which I did, it was more than merely unforgettable. It was like the face of the devil. I could see inside of the guy's soul almost as I looked at his face. There was something in him. He was like possessed. That's the way I felt. So maybe it's like I'm just guessing 2 or 3 weeks after that, I'm driving around doing what I was supposed to do for my job. I work for a newspaper called the Reno Evening Gazette, Nevada State Journal, and I think that's shortly before they merged and called it the Gazette Journal. They both all the time were owned by the same company. So in any event, I believe it was closer to Sierra Street downtown. That's another street that passes through downtown, and it was closer to California Avenue. I saw the guy again. So we see people, you've seen people around your community, probably seen them multiple times, and you're used to their faces. You don't particularly know who those individuals are, but I would bet that most of the people that you just see casually on the street are not total freak balls. They're not total more than just weirdos. I know today people say, well, the guy's a weirdo or this person's a weirdo. No, this guy was not just a weirdo. There was something wrong with him. And my heart just kind of felt queasy when I kind of ran into the guy. I never spoke with him. I never tried to contact him. I just knew that I would never forget him. Of course, working for the newspaper, I think it was sometime during that period after I'd seen this strange character several times, I looked at the newspaper, and as I did, that's what my job was, but I was interested in the news, of course, so I looked in the obituaries in the news, and I saw an obituary of a little girl, and she was 7 years old, and I'm not going to give her specific name here because I believe, even though she's deceased, she and her family deserve some peace right now. But her obituary, I'm just going to read it for you right now. It says, I'll just come up with a fake name. I'll just say her name was Kathleen McGillicuddy. So the obituary said, Kathleen McGillicuddy, a 7-year-old daughter of, and it listed her parents. She died Sunday in a Reno hospital. So native of Reno, she was born on July 29th of 1974. So that date put her at 7 years old, and she was a student at Grace Warner Elementary School in Reno. The obituary listed her surviving relatives, and it also listed the date and time of her funeral. Now, her funeral was listed as being scheduled for about 4 days after this obituary appeared, and that's where she was to be buried in Mountain View Cemetery, which overlooks the city of Reno. So I remembered that story. I didn't, the obit, but when you see an obit like that for a little child, it didn't say how she died or, what became of her. I would think that if she had died in an accident, such as a car wreck or fallen down some stairs or something, I would have known about it because that's my job to know these things, and that was my job to know these things. And I'd never heard of it, but it stuck on my mind because when you see a little girl or a little child of, just basically a baby of 7 years old, and you see their obit, you always wonder. I'm sure that's happened to you. You've seen obituaries of very young people, even people in their mid-20s and under, and a lot of times it doesn't list how they perished. And so this really stuck with me, but I had no idea that her passing would become a very pivotal, important part of our entire community of Reno, and her passing is something which I will never, ever forget. Now, about 1 or 2 days after I read that obituary of this little Kathleen McGillicuddy in the newspaper, like I say, that's a fake name that I put here for right now because I don't want her family, if they're still living in Reno, to really have to deal with this. And so, yeah, but about 2, maybe 3 days after I read that obituary, police found her body. Her body was in a dumpster. Her body had been thrown away like trash. Her body had been stolen from a Reno funeral home. And nobody knew at that time exactly who stole her body and who threw her body in the trash. And her body was taken, I assume, from a casket. And this little girl had died of a brain tumor. That's what came out. And then because of what happened. It's what reporters have to do sometimes. Some people hate reporters for doing this. Other people know that that's their job, to get to the matter or to find out what relatives think about what happened. And it was my job, like it or not. You'd say, like, police officers have to go to people's homes to inform them of a death or something that's horrible. Well, reporters oftentimes have to go to the homes of relatives of deceased people that died in mysterious circumstances or when horrible things happened to those individuals. And this was just such a case. And that is the reason, like a lot of people, dislike reporters. That's why they dislike journalists, because journalists can be very intrusive. And my job was to go over to the home of the deceased girl who had been stolen from a funeral home, her body, and dumped in the trash. So I went over to the little home of Kathleen, and none of my bosses told me to do this. This is just a natural thing that a reporter of my job function had to do. And I went over to her home. And I am able to be soft and kind and a loving soul and not intrusive, not like I was barging in or knocking on their front door or just, saying, hey, this happened, that happened, blah, blah, blah. As I recall, I entered her family's home showing great respect, with calmness in my heart, as calm as my heart could be. And I saw the little girl's mother and the little girl's father. And you got to remember that this little girl had died just less than a week before I entered their home. And they had already been going through the shock of having their daughter perish. And then on top of that, they had to go through the situation where the child's body was stolen. And so they'd already been racked in grief, of course. And the father told me, the quotation that I used, that I put in the story, the first paragraph of the page 1 story, of course it was page 1, that the father said that the family and he have been, quote, stunned, absolutely numbed. Now the body had been found in a dumpster that was right behind the funeral home. And police were still investigating, and police were really giving me as much information as they could. You got to keep in mind that this was the days before cell phone, the internet, social media, and whatnot. And police in those days, as far as I know, they were a lot more open about what was going on. They didn't reveal every little detail of crime scenes, and district attorneys did not at that time. But today, in today's society, police and district attorneys, they lock themselves, and they're like encapsulate themselves, and they're like, they don't give any details. They'll give a few sentences, or they'll do a boring press conference without any information. And reporters oftentimes today, I understand, are not allowed to talk specifically necessarily with the cops unless they have used those cops as sources or whatnot. So in my era, I was able to talk with some police officers, and the police officers, of course, gave me the tragic details, and police said that that it just brought tears to the eyes of the police officers. That whoever stole the body kept the body in a white, clean, I would call it an angelic white, fluffy dress that the child wore in her casket. And when the child's body was dumped in the trash bin, the body was still clothed in the angelic white dress. To me, as I covered this story, it was as if I was writing about a little princess that was lost, a little sweet, beautiful child, almost as if an angel. And yes, she was gone. And the quotation in my story from the father, whom I'm not identifying right here, was that we were already racked in terrible grief from what happened. He said further, according to my story from almost 50 years ago, that it keeps hanging on my mind. Who could have taken my little girl? I just can't believe it. Yeah, I had to report the story. That was my job. And it was, of course, of interest to the entire community, as it should have been, because the folks in the community, whether we like to say this or not, they needed to be out on the lookout. The people in the community need to be aware of this kind of thing so that it could not happen again. And so whoever did this horrible, wretched thing, who must have been from hell, in my mind, that's just my personal opinion. I'm allowed to say that. That's my personal opinion. That the people in the community needed to know what had happened so the people in the community could be on the lookout for this monster. So I of course, did what I needed to do. And the father also told me that police came to tell him, the police went to the family's home after the body was discovered and told the family. And the father told me that when that happened, you're just adjusting to the death, and then they came and hit you with something like that. But when the father spoke, this father did not speak with the inflection that I am giving now. Put this in your mind, what I'm about to say. The father's face was expressionless. It was void. It's as if the soul had been carved out of the father. And the mother was there, but they were in obvious shock. They couldn't handle it. They just had a tough time, as you can imagine. But not only that, the father said that he was financially broken and he was a truck driver and he didn't have proper insurance for his child, who suffered from this brain tumor for about 18 months before the child died. And the father went into, as I recall, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And I believe it was something like $225,000. We didn't get into those details on that particular day. Of course not. He volunteered that information to me. But he also said that, quote, and I'm looking at my story right now, he said, quote, it would have had to have been someone who was really sick and mentally disturbed. Why violate the body of a dead person? Someone who has been through all the suffering that she has been through. Now, that evening, I also spoke with the girl's uncle. And I'm not going to say what the name of the girl's uncle is here right now. But he told me, as I'm quoting from the story again, he said, I hope they catch the person before he does something like this again. The uncle of the child also told me that the girl's parents have already been through, quote, tremendous suffering. Now they have to go through so much more. Something that no one should never have to. Now, at the time, there was no specific law in Nevada for something called, when you take a body, I don't remember, I think it's called, it's a bad term, and it's when people take a body and do bad things to molest the body. And it was later determined by the district attorney's office that the culprit, whoever took the body, had left DNA, not DNA. No, DNA didn't really exist then. It was sperm. I'm not going to say anything else about it. You don't need to hear any more about that aspect of it, and I don't need to say anything else. Just picture that in your mind. What if something like this had happened in your community today? How would you feel if you had a child and this kind of thing had happened to your child? What would you want to think? I got the impression that this was not a wealthy family. This was a family that had tough times even to make ends meet before this all happened, and the father did what needed to be done as a father to help take care of his child the best he could. And in those days, and it is still now much of the time, to raise as much money of his own funds. And he went deep, deep, deep into debt. And then this happens. 17-year-old California youth was charged in connection with the disappearance and theft of the little girl's body. And I was shown a mugshot of the 17-year-old boy who, at the time, his name was not released to the public because, see, the youngster was not an adult, but he was the monster that I had seen earlier on the streets, riding a bicycle, the person whose red hair was sticking up and his eyes looked like those of the devil. His eyes looked like he was from hell. And I'm not making that up, and I'm not making up that part of the story. It really happened. And it affected me. And of course, when you're a reporter, you are supposed to remain neutral. So professionally, I remained neutral. I wrote the facts. And the facts were that the young man was a runaway from the state of California. And I talked to a person that at that time was a detective at the Reno Police Department. The detective's name was Rick Brown. And of course, Rick told me, as I already indicated, that the body of the name of the alleged culprit, he was alleged at that time, his name would not be released. Sergeant Brown declined to release the details of the investigation, including specific evidence that was found during the probe, but the culprit was booked and put into what was called Wittenberg Hall in Reno. That was a detention facility for juveniles. Sadly, at that time, the state of Nevada had no law against doing horrible things to bodies of dead people, like the words that I should say here are just touching the bodies in inappropriate ways. And as a result of this situation, a couple years later, the Nevada State Legislature passed a law that it was a felony to touch dead bodies in inappropriate ways. But the police could not charge the juvenile who, with that particular crime. The most they could charge him with was theft and burglary. The most he could get if convicted at that time was merely 7 years. I don't know how long you would want to have such a person thrown away into prison if such a thing had happened to your child. Maybe you'd want the person to go in for life or a bit longer. Let me know what you think. Brief period of time, police and the district attorney's office released the name of the suspect because he was being charged as an adult, because it was an adult type of crime and it was a heinous crime. And so they released his name, and his name was Colin Dickey, COLINDICKEY. And he is the same monster, like I already said, whom I saw on the bicycle. And it sickened me every time I saw his photograph. Every time I saw his mugshot, it made me sick. It made me sick to my stomach. And I still had to write about this particular event a few more times before the story transitioned into the judicial area of the law. And of course, as you can imagine, this Colin Dickey was convicted of burglary and theft, and he was sentenced to a mere 7 years in the Nevada State Prison. But that was not the end of the story. About 4 years later, after the body was found and after this Dickey fellow was sent to prison, there was a trial in the Washoe District Court. It's Washoe County, where Reno is located, and Reno is the seat of Washoe County. So this was in the Washoe County Courthouse, downtown Reno. There was a lawsuit. It was a civil suit between the parents and family of little Kathleen and the funeral home. And the parents had sued the funeral home for, I believe it was something like $3 million. And after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury ruled, it was 6 women and 2 men. They only deliberated for 3 hours, and they determined that the funeral home cannot be held responsible for a perverted monster who kicked down a door and then stole and assaulted the body of the 7-year-old little girl. So the funeral home was not held accountable for their security process. So here we are. It's one of many, many stories that will remain on my mind. They don't weigh me down. It's just that was my job. And I would like to know what you think about this kind of story. What do you feel about what happened to little Kathleen McGillicuddy? That's a fictional name, like I said, but there really was a little girl, and I'm not saying her name here, of course, but let us protect our young people in our society. Let us give them the love, and let's shield them from crimes like this, even after they are gone from this earth. Children and adults who perish need proper security to protect their remains so nothing horrible happens like it did for this little girl.